Welcome to Kerusi Panas. I'm Bridget Welsh, and this is episode 7 that looks at different hot seats in Malaysia's coming state elections. I've gotten in my car in Penang and driven north to the beautiful state of Kedah. I haven't gone that far because I've recognized that the southern part of Kedah is another hot area in terms of potential outcome in the state elections. There are a whole series of seats that are up under review, from Bandar Baru Kulim and Lunas to seats north in Merbau constituency of Tanjung Dawai and Bukit Selambau. It's this latter seat, Bukit Selambau, that I focused on in this episode. For those of us who are political scientists, we know Bukit Selambau because it's had a rich history in terms of scholarship. This stems from the by-election of March 2009 that garnered considerable academic attention. It's also a place that has actually had some very interesting political turnover, and it is, I think, on the front line of where Kedah politics will move, but also reflection of what's happening on the national stage. Bukit Selambau is one of 2 seats in the parliamentary constituency of Merbau, located north of Sungai Petani. It covers a relatively large area of over 200 square kilometers. For those of you who are not so familiar about this area, this is an extremely important one for Malaysia. It's a place of Southeast Asia's oldest civilization. Yes, Southeast Asia's oldest civilization. People focus on places like Borobudur or temples in Cambodia, but it's Malaysia where you find some of the oldest archaeological findings. And this is in the area of the Bujak Valley. There are findings of early temples and early Candi, such as Candi Bukit Batu Pahat. We've also seen findings involving the inscription of Kala, which is the ancient word for Kedah, which has been inscribed in documents that go back to Mesopotamia as much as 1300 BC. The discovery in this area goes back only to the 1st century BC, but there's seen as potential to go further back. This issue of excavation and heritage is a very challenging one. Under the Sanusi government, excavation is stopped. But these issues involve all of the different communities in Kedah and in Malaysia more generally. And the question about the diversity and the different strains and the places of different communities are very paramount, both in Kedah and nationally. Bukit Selambau is a place of those different communities and crossroads. When you drive through this area, through the mountains, through the beautiful sense of the river, in the Muda River, which, by the way, plays a very important role in providing water supply to Kedah and Penang, this diversity is very much on display. Unlike a seat like Kuala Kubu Baru in Selangor, where the node is the town, and the town is small, but it's substantive, what we see in a place like Bukit Selambau are many smaller towns. This is the way we can see that history and geographic space help to shape the diversity and the patterns of settlement. We see Siamese villages along the Muda River bank. We see a history of Malay settlements that have also transformed with the creation of communities around religious schools and new kind of vibrant economic centers. We see historic Chinese new villages. There are 2 major ones at Bukit Selambau. And of course, large number of Indians who live largely on the estates, but are increasingly moving to places in the towns like Sungai Lala. This is a place where the population numbers are increasing, and you can see that the infrastructure is facing strains. Nowhere is this clearer than the issue of water supply. With growing industrialization coming in around Sungai Petani, demanding more water and growing population, the question and the need to upgrade the facilities is paramount. And like in the seat of Kubang Ratan, which I focused on northern Kedah, we see a situation in Bukit Selambau where there are large areas that are just not getting the water they need, and there are massive leaks in the pipes. This is an issue that the state government has failed to address. It's also an issue that the federal government has failed to address, because both of these governments do matter in addressing these concerns. With this diversity in this historic settlement, The questions about how to accommodate the different needs of different communities is a very interesting one. In the academic scholarship of Bukit Selambau, which is the reason why I initially focused on this seat, because there's a rich academic discussion about voting patterns that stretch back to the by-election of 2009. In 2009, there was a by-election fielding 15 candidates. Yes, 15 candidates. At that time, what we were seeing is a rise of identity politics around Hindrath, around concerns associated with the representation of the Indian community, particularly in terms of emotive issues about temples, religious conversion, the questions about support for Tamil schools, the questions of support for identity. These issues still remain quite emotive in a place like Bukit Selambau. And in looking at this seat, it is a question about representation in Kedah of minorities, but also representation more broadly about the way ethnic politics and identity politics are transforming. The candidates that are contesting in this seat are three. The incumbent is a man called Sumagam Rangasamy. He's from PKR. He was in the news recently because he was reinstated. He was originally dropped, but he was returned and fielded here. He's 64. He formerly sat on the EXCO in the first part of one of the first three governments here in Kedah, right after Pakatan Harapan was elected. But of course, that was only for a 22-month period. He's a planter by profession, became a manager in one of the plantations. But he's also somebody that has made his way from being a rubber tapper all the way to management position. He came up the hard way. As a result, he's seen to understand the issues that ordinary people are facing. He faces off against a candidate from PAS, a man called Azizan Hamza. He's an ustaz. He's also in his 60s, 69. He's well known and quite respected among the community. He's not from Bukit Selambau technically. He's from the parliamentary constituency of Murbuk more generally. He is seen as an important local figure. The third candidate in the seat is a man called Dinesh Muniandi, a 32-year-old young man. He's an independent, but I didn't find that many posters when I was driving around, and not much information about him. So we'll see whether or not he actually is able to garner considerable support. Keep in mind that in 2008, this is one of the few seats where an independent did win, but so far there isn't that same level of gravitas that we found in the 2008 period. Bukit Selambau is comprised of 79,000 voters, 61% of which are Malay, 21% are Indian, and 18% of them are Chinese. The Teochew community is particularly common in terms of the Chinese composition. And looking at a place like Bukit Selambau, there are two major things that stand out that speak not only to the issue of representation in Kedah, but also nationally. One is the issue of inclusion of minorities. When we look at Kedah, we have to recognize that while it's part of the Malay heartland, it has a very different ethnic composition than other parts of the Malay heartland, like Terengganu and Kelantan. There are 7% Indians and 13% Chinese, and there are also a share of Siamese voters in Kedah. So we're looking at almost a quarter of the population that actually come from different ethnic communities. And the question of representation has been very salient. First has been the issue of representation of the Indian and Chinese communities. And in particular, this seat has been given to an Indian candidate, traditionally at MIC. While the seat was created first in 1986 and initially given to UMNO, it became an MIC seat. And then it was given to an Indian candidate within PKR. The questions about Tamil schools, poor infrastructure, temple protection, particularly salient right now in the northern part of Kedah and Alistar, are quite prominent in the conversations that I had with Indian voters. Keep in mind, of the two coalitions, only one coalition is fielding only one Indian candidate, and that's in the seat of Bukit Selambau. Pakatan Nasional has chosen not to field any Indian candidate in Kedah. So we see the issues of representation being tied to this idea of getting representation from the person of your own ethnic community. The issue of nominal representation is also, by the way, salient in the Malay community as well. This is why we can see that PAS has very strategically put a Malay candidate, hoping to tap into the desire of voters to have someone of the same ethnic group among Malay voters. For the Chinese in the area of Bukit Selambau, their question has not been about nominal representation. It's about whether or not they want to turn out to vote at all. In GE15, we saw a considerable drop in turnout. Malays generally in Malaysia have higher turnout than other communities, in part because they have more political choices, and there's been more mobilization of this community compared to others. But in a place like Bukit Selambau, you have a very sharp difference. So there's a 17% difference among Chinese voter turnout at 63% compared to Malay turnout at 80%. Indian turnout, by the way, is at 72%. So the low Chinese turnout speaks to a whole series of issues. Part of it is that many of the voters have left for jobs outside. But part of it is that many of the Chinese voters that I spoke to felt that they couldn't actually participate, and that they didn't feel that there was purpose to why they participate. They didn't think that they would make a difference. So these questions about inclusion of the Indian community, speaking to the issues, having nominal representation, for the Chinese participating at all, are quite salient. The estate workers that I spoke to on the estates were very cognizant of these issues from a perspective of Indian rights. But the story of Bukit Selambau electorally has been a very different one. And that is, we've seen, according to scholarship, considerable crossover voting, people voting outside your ethnic. For Pakatan Harapan to win this seat, it will need considerable Malay support. It will need higher Chinese turnout. For Pakatan Nasional to win this seat, it will need the crossover vote to be minimal. They would like to have the majority of Malays vote for them. The pattern of voting in Bukit Selambau has moved away from crossover voting to greater ethnic polarization, which we found in GE15. Pakatan Nasional won 69% of the Malay vote. This is why Bukit Selambau is seen to be very competitive, because the Malay vote and the changing demographics of this seat really favor PAS in this particular round. Chinese vote has been with Pakatan Harapan at 97%, but the Indians have been more split with only 64%. And it's interesting where the Indians that voted for the MIC, which are around a third of them, where will they go? Will they turn to Pakatan Harapan, or will they turn to Pakatan Nasional? Beyond the question associated with crossover vote among different communities and whether or not how ethnic communities are represented, are serious questions about the youth vote. This is an area where there is starving for job opportunities, concerns about wages, a lack of educational support. What we can see is that the youth vote was very splintered. It comprises 37% of the electorate in a place like Bukit Selambau. Yes, similar to what I talked about earlier in the series in Galas. PN won a majority of that at 54% in GE15. But there was considerable share that was elsewhere, with Pakatan Harapan winning 36% of the youth vote. So not only will this question be about the issues associated with ethnic crossover, it will be about whether or not the candidates appeal to younger people. Both candidates are in their 60s. There are increasingly many more youth activities taking place, but many young people I spoke to were less enthusiastic about both candidates, feeling a sense of lack of connection compared to the past. Many of the young people still live outside, and this includes across different communities. It's an expectation that younger Malay voters may come back in higher numbers because especially the ties that they have to some of the local madrasas. But it's a question of whether or not these groups are mobilized, and especially young voters being able to afford to come back. Unlike in the northern part of Kedah, where you saw a lot of infighting, There seemed to be more cooperation among the different coalition partners in both coalitions, between Persatuan PAS and also between Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan. The MIC in particular and the MIC's role in terms of mobilizing vote will shape the outcome in this seat. It's not a coincidence that leaders at the national level are reaching out to the MIC because it will matter in terms of their mobilization on the ground. We also saw similar, much more interaction between UMNO and Pakatan Harapan as the recognition that all of these seats are now much more seriously under threat than they were before. And without this cooperation of political crossover vote, you wouldn't actually potentially have victories. For Pakatan Nasional, they are quietly confident that they think that the trends will continue. They look to the seat of Padang Serai as a place where they can point to very significant support among the Malay community, which reached up to 80%. They think if those trends continue in this other part of Kedah, that you will see a result that will move to their favor. Whoever wins the seat, the issues of how different communities think about each other and vote and support each other, whether or not they're included, will still be paramount. Bukit Selambau will be an indication of whether or not ethnic polarization in voting will continue. Whoever wins this seat, it will be necessary to be able to engage across communities, to hear the different voices. Bukit Selambau was before a place of crossover. We'll see whether or not this continues in this particular constituency. Thanks very much for following me here on Kerusi Panas. Tomorrow, we head further south.